When an empath finally stops forgiving, Carl Jung discovered, every mask in their world begins to fall away. Not only from others, but from themselves as well. Those who once appeared loving expose their manipulation. Relationships built on kindness reveal their hidden exploitation. And perhaps most startling of all, the empath realizes they've been wearing the greatest mask of all, the mask of endless forgiveness, the one that's been quietly draining their soul. Picture this moment. You've forgiven them once again, the one who betrayed your trust, mistook your kindness for weakness, and treated your empathy as an infinite resource. You smile and say, "It's okay." You take on their guilt so they can sleep peacefully, while you lie awake questioning your worth. But this time, something feels different. Instead of the familiar relief that comes from keeping the peace, you feel something new, rage. Not explosive fury, but the calm, sacred rage of a soul that's finally reached its limit. Jung called this the collision with the shadow, the instant when everything you've suppressed surges into consciousness. And for the empath, that collision changes everything. But here's what Jung discovered that few ever mention. The empath's endless forgiveness isn't true compassion. It's what could be called survival forgiveness, a trauma response disguised as virtue. Jung saw this pattern again and again in his work. He wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." The empath doesn't forgive from strength, but from fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as bad. Early in life, they learned their value depended on how much pain they could absorb without complaint. Jung described this as the sacrifice of the authentic self for social acceptance. But when the empath stops forgiving, something revolutionary begins. The entire social structure built around their self-sacrifice starts to crumble. That's when the masks fall, first from others, then from themselves. Jung's most radical insight centered on what he called the shadow, everything we deny in ourselves and project onto others. For empaths, this shadow hides something unexpected: their own right to healthy selfishness, justified anger, and sacred boundaries. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For the empath, this darkness isn't evil. It's their buried instinct for self-preservation, the part of them that knows when they're being used but stays silent in the name of being good. When they stop forgiving, they aren't becoming cruel. They're integrating the shadow, reclaiming the pieces of themselves they abandoned to sustain one-sided relationships. Jung identified clear patterns in those who begin reclaiming their psychological boundaries, what can be called the 8 signs of sacred rebellion. And if you recognize them within yourself, you may be experiencing what Jung described as the birth of the authentic self. Sign 1. The energy stops leaking. The first sign is what might be called the energy reversal. Instead of unconsciously absorbing everyone's emotional waste, you begin to ask, is this really mine to carry? Jung noted that individuation, the process of becoming oneself, always begins with drawing the line between self and other. You start noticing how drained you feel after certain interactions. You learn to distinguish genuine remorse from manipulative guilt. Most importantly, you stop believing you are responsible for other people's emotional stability. Jung wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." The awakening empath looks inward and finally sees their own depletion. And what's extraordinary is that others sense this transformation before you even speak of it. Energy vampires begin to keep their distance. They can feel that you've stopped feeding them. Sign 2. The performance ends. Jung referred to this as the death of the persona, the social mask we wear to gain acceptance. For empaths, that mask is the endlessly understanding one. But once they stop forgiving automatically, that role becomes impossible to play. You stop saying, "It's fine," when it isn't. You stop making excuses for harmful behavior. You stop performing emotional labor for people who never offered it in return. This marks the end of compassion without reciprocity. Jung warned that dropping the persona feels terrifying. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But authenticity comes with a price. It means disappointing those who preferred the performance. Sign 3. The manipulation becomes visible. This is where Jung's insight into projection becomes essential. When empaths stop forgiving by default, they break free from what could be called the empathy exploitation cycle. Suddenly, Manipulation stands out in sharp detail. You recognize love bombing, the flattery designed to earn your forgiveness. You notice guilt trips disguised as vulnerability. You see how your compassion was turned into a weapon against your own limits. Jung wrote, "Everything unconscious is projected." The awakened empath stops projecting their own integrity onto others and finally sees people as they truly are, not as they wish them to be. Sign 4. The guilt loses its power. Jung observed that guilt often comes from internalized shame planted by those who profit from our compliance. When empaths stop forgiving out of reflex, they begin to experience what can be called guilt immunity. They start recognizing guilt as a form of control. You no longer feel guilty for having standards. You stop apologizing for boundaries. You begin to notice that those who try to guilt you back into forgiveness are simply exposing how invested they are in your self-abandonment. Jung called this the integration of healthy selfishness. It's not cruelty, it's the long-dormant instinct for self-preservation finally coming alive. Sign 5. The relationships reshape themselves. Jung believed that genuine transformation inevitably alters our relationships. When empaths stop forgiving everyone unconditionally, what I call the great sorting begins. Connections built on exploitation naturally dissolve, while authentic ones deepen. Some people vanish once you stop being their emotional dumping ground. Others attempt to guilt you into resuming your old role. But a few rare souls respect your new boundaries and meet you in true reciprocity. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." Yet this transformation only occurs when both individuals show up authentically. Comment if you've noticed people treating you differently once you found your backbone, how they sensed your change before you ever voiced it. Sign 6. The anger becomes sacred. Jung recognized that anger is often repressed wisdom. When empaths stop forgiving reflexively, they awaken what can be called sacred rage, not a destructive force, but a protective one that declares, "No more." You feel anger about past violations you once minimized, fury over the boundaries you never set. This anger isn't toxic, it's information. It's your psyche revealing where you've abandoned yourself. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." The pain of realizing how you've been treated becomes the fire that forges your new boundaries. Sign 7. The pattern recognition activates. Jung's work on psychological types revealed that empaths often possess finely tuned intuition. Once they stop forgiving automatically, that intuition sharpens into pattern recognition. You start noticing the same tactics repeated by different people. The cycle of transgression, fake remorse, love bombing, and repetition. You detect emotional predators before they fully expose themselves. This isn't paranoia, it's clarity. Jung called this differentiated consciousness, the ability to perceive truth without emotional distortion. Sign 8. The self emerges. The final sign is what Jung described as the encounter with the self. Not the ego, not the persona, but the integrated whole of your being. When empaths stop forgiving on autopilot, their authentic self begins to surface. You rediscover preferences long buried beneath years of accommodating others. You find your voice after prolonged silence. You realize that your needs, desires, and boundaries are just as sacred as anyone else's. If these transformation patterns resonate with you, remember this truth. My breaking point became my breakthrough. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The empath who stops forgiving finally claims that privilege. Yet Jung never romanticized this awakening. He called it the dark night of the soul, a stage where old patterns must die before new ones can be born. For empaths, this feels like a kind of social death, since so much of their identity was built around being endlessly forgiving. You may lose friends who only valued your compliance. Family might accuse you of changing. You might even feel guilty for setting boundaries that should have existed long ago. Jung warned, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." The empath must descend into their own psychological underworld, confronting the rage and sorrow they've suppressed before they can rise into authentic selfhood. And when they stop forgiving automatically, something profound happens to those around them, what I call the great unmasking. People can no longer hide behind the empath's perpetual understanding. The narcissist can't use your empathy to dodge accountability. The manipulator can't twist your compassion into compliance. The emotional vampire can't feast on your endless tolerance. Your clarity forces them to reveal their true nature. Jung understood this perfectly. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Yet he also recognized another truth. Sometimes, people aren't disturbed by their own reflection, but by your refusal to carry their shadow for them. And the most startling revelation comes when the empath's own mask finally drops. They realize that endless forgiveness was its own subtle form of manipulation, a way to maintain connection through self-sacrifice rather than through genuine honesty. Jung called this the recognition of one's own shadow. The empath must face the uncomfortable truth that their forgiveness was often driven not by love, but by fear. Fear of rejection, fear of confrontation, fear of being seen as unkind. This realization isn't shameful. It's liberating. It means you can finally love from wholeness instead of woundedness. Give from choice, not compulsion. Jung differentiated between unconscious and conscious processes. When empaths abandon automatic forgiveness, they cultivate what might be called conscious forgiveness. Forgiveness that serves the soul, not the ego. This kind of forgiveness doesn't rush in immediately after harm. It arises after truth-telling, after setting boundaries, after allowing natural consequences to unfold. It's forgiveness that includes justice, not one that avoids it. Jung wrote, "Forgiveness is not the suppression of a justifiable reaction. True forgiveness honors the wound while releasing the grudge. It sees clearly while choosing not to be consumed by resentment." Jung also understood that psychological energy follows natural laws. When empaths stop leaking energy through compulsive forgiveness, that freed energy transforms into something extraordinary, what can be called creative self-expression. At last, the empath begins to reclaim their own energy. Resources once spent on others' pain now become fuel for their own dreams, goals, and healing. You stop merely reacting to or absorbing other people's dramas and start creating. You return to the passions you once abandoned in order to be available for everyone else's crises. You invest in relationships that inspire and uplift you rather than drain you. This isn't selfishness. Jung called it individuation, the natural unfolding of a complete human being who contributes to the world from fullness, not emptiness. Jung believed that genuine individual transformation generates collective change. When empaths stop forgiving automatically, they begin to model a new way of being. What I call the authenticity virus starts to spread. Your courage to set boundaries gives others permission to find their own. Your refusal to support dysfunction exposes the systems that rely on empathic compliance. Your authentic self-expression reminds people they don't need to perform to deserve love. This is why such transformation feels threatening to some. You're not only changing yourself, you're rewriting the unspoken emotional contracts that govern everyone around you. In Jung's understanding, individuation allows a person to form what he called conscious relationships, connections between two whole beings rather than two wounded halves seeking completion. When empaths stop forgiving by reflex, they finally become capable of that level of connection. You begin to attract those who can meet your authenticity with their own. You build relationships grounded in mutual respect instead of mutual pain. You love from a place of overflow rather than lack. Conscious relationships don't require endless forgiveness because they're founded on honesty from the very beginning. Conflicts are acknowledged and resolved rather than buried until they explode. Jung's process of individuation involves integrating all aspects of the psyche: light and shadow, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious. For empaths, this means uniting compassion with discernment. You learn to feel deeply without absorbing everything you feel. You gain the ability to witness another's pain without making it your job to fix it. You become what might be called compassionately detached. You care, but you no longer carry. This integration produces what Jung described as psychological wholeness, the ability to respond from your full range of human potential rather than from old patterns of wounded empathy. Jung also recognized that true psychological development is inseparable from spiritual evolution. When empaths stop forgiving automatically, they often enter what could be called sacred disillusionment, the painful yet necessary death of spiritual bypassing. You realize that endless forgiveness wasn't enlightenment, it was avoidance. It wasn't spiritual progress, it was spiritual paralysis. True spiritual growth requires facing the shadow, setting firm boundaries, and honoring your own divine essence just as deeply as you honor others. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And that includes becoming someone who forgives consciously, loves authentically, and serves from a place of wholeness. Jung was also among the first to recognize how closely the psyche and the body are intertwined. When empaths stop absorbing everyone else's emotions, their bodies often begin to heal from what can be described as energetic toxicity. Chronic fatigue starts to lift when you're no longer processing other people's emotional waste. Anxiety eases as you release the need to monitor others' moods. Even autoimmune issues can improve once you stop turning your suppressed anger inward and attacking your own boundaries. Your nervous system finally begins to rest when it's no longer perpetually activated by the emotional chaos around you. This calm is the body's natural response to psychological integrity, to the return of boundaries that protect rather than imprison. Jung observed that individuation ultimately leads to what he called the development of wisdom, the ability to live from awareness rather than reaction, from balance rather than sacrifice. Empaths who have embraced conscious forgiveness often evolve into what can be called wounded healers, those who can guide others without losing themselves in the process. You learn to recognize empathic wounding in others without being triggered by it. You can offer wisdom and support without feeling responsible for the outcome. You become a lighthouse, illuminating the way for others without chasing ships lost in the dark. This wisdom isn't cold or detached. It's warm but boundaried, caring yet centered, loving without self-erasure. Jung believed that personal healing naturally contributes to collective healing. When empaths embody conscious forgiveness, they begin to dismantle what I call the cycle of empathic exploitation. This cycle breaker effect changes everything. You model healthy connection for your children. You refuse to reenact family dysfunction. You demonstrate that empathy does not require losing yourself. You become living evidence that sensitivity can coexist with strength. And this impact extends far beyond your immediate world. Every time you set a boundary, you silently give others permission to set their own. Each act of conscious forgiveness over automatic forgiveness contributes to the healing of the collective. Jung loved paradoxes because they revealed profound truths. And the paradox of the empath's journey is this: when you stop forgiving everyone else, you finally learn how to forgive yourself. When you stop absorbing the guilt of others, you release the shame that has weighed you down. You forgive yourself for staying too long in toxic relationships. You forgive yourself for betraying your own limits. You forgive yourself for confusing trauma bonds with love. This act of self-forgiveness is the deepest healing of all. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." The empath who stops forgiving everyone else at last becomes capable of forgiving themselves. Not for being human, but for forgetting their own divine worth. So here's what you must understand. Your forgiveness is sacred. It's not a gift to be handed out freely to anyone who demands it. It's something to be offered consciously, when your soul is ready, when truth has been spoken, when justice has been honored. Jung devoted his life to studying what it means to become whole and discovered that wholeness always requires saying no to what diminishes you so that you can say yes to what honors you. If you recognize yourself in these 8 signs, you are already walking the very path Jung described. Trust the process. Trust your anger. Trust your boundaries. Trust that becoming who you truly are is not selfish, it's necessary. Your refusal to forgive automatically doesn't make you cold, it makes you real. And the world desperately needs more real empaths. People who love from fullness, serve from choice, and forgive from wisdom. Because when an empath stops forgiving, every mask falls away. The masks others wore to manipulate your kindness, and the ones you wore to shield yourself from their disapproval. And in that sacred unmasking, something extraordinary emerges. Your authentic self. You realize you don't need perfection to deserve love. You don't need endless understanding to be valuable. You don't need to carry everyone's pain to prove your worth. Jung's greatest message to empaths was this: individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are, is not just your right, it is your responsibility. Not only to yourself, but to a world that needs conscious empaths, boundaried healers, and people who love from wholeness rather than from woundedness. If you want to explore this transformation more deeply, look into my video about what happens when the empath stops pleasing others and begins seeing the truth. A full exploration of the path from people-pleasing to authentic empowerment. Your evolution from automatic forgiveness to conscious choice isn't just personal healing, it's a quiet revolution. And Jung would be proud. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.